is for a 2-day workshop that I'll be giving at the end of next month, Saturday and Sunday. They are full days, both days. The first day will cover everything from development through post. It'll be our production day. And the second day is putting the gas in that lovely car you just made and finding a destination for it in the form of financing and distribution. And we'll even talk about what happens should your vehicle crash, post-distribution remedies. So it's, I've included a broad outline. It's not very specific at all, but lots of detail. And the reason that we're putting on this workshop is I keep getting asked many of the same questions over and over, and thought that a lot of people would benefit from an intensive workshop that covered a lot of the issues that I get asked about. It's going to be contract-based, which means I will work from agreement to agreement, and through those agreements you'll understand the process of that. By the end, you will know the major agreements and major issues in those agreements from development through post-production. Since it's so broad, though, I wanted to focus on just one aspect so that this isn't just a quick overview that you really don't benefit from. And I want to skip to a topic that we're going to cover the second day, and that's film financing. Now, the interesting thing about financing is that most of the materials out there always spend an almost equal amount of time on something that I think is virtually irrelevant to the vast majority of indie filmmakers: studio financing. The reality is that we should all be so lucky as to have such a deal. But the vast majority of people that walk through my doors don't have those deals. There are exceptions, but not the vast majority. And I think it would be a waste of everyone's time if we focused on the same thing that all of those materials do. I don't know, quite frankly, why they do. Maybe it's because if you spend all your time on the thing that most people need, which is straightforward equity and debt financing, you run up against the obvious question of, yeah, but where do I find that money? And people don't have a good answer for that. But what you can do are several things to maximize your chances of getting that money. But first, you have to understand how to structure the deal and how to present it in a way that will look both professional and appetizing to an investor. So how do we do that? First, let me backtrack and say that there are a lot of naysayers right now who say that given our current economic crisis, this is a terrible time to be making film. I think otherwise. The reason I think otherwise is because, almost by definition, the people that you'll be tapping as investors will be high net worth individuals, so-called accredited investors. And I highly recommend that you limit your search to accredited investors. Why? Because if you hit up the grandma who believes in your vision wholeheartedly and is willing to put her life savings into your vision, you run the risk of being sued by her as a disgruntled investor. And if you haven't satisfied the requirements for the number of non-accredited investors with your investment, she may be able to rescind her investment. What does that mean? It means essentially that she gets her money back and your project comes to a complete halt. It It's the death knell for projects. In fact, the only thing that even comes close is when people greenlight a project without having the full production budget raised, and they scramble to put together finishing funds, and they just aren't able to do so in time. That and so-called acts of God, things that trigger the force majeure provisions of your contracts, those are the death knells of production. You want to avoid that. The first thing you do is, once you have an attachment, or a potential attachment to your project, you must form an entity, and do so just before you are about to sign your first major agreement in connection with the project. Why do you do this? You do it in part to limit your liability. What do I mean? Well, my first day of corporations in law school, we all sauntered into the class, and the professor had drawn a square on the chalkboard. He said, "Class, what is this?" Of course, we snickered under our breath. Finally, someone chimed up and said, "It's a square." He said, "No, this is a corporation. It is a separate entity. It exists separate from each of you. It is a living, breathing entity, and I want you to treat it as such." The point is, you create a separate entity, single-purpose production entity, and it can be a corporation, either a regular C Corp, or an S Corp, or an LLC, a limited liability company, and you pour all of the assets, meaning you transfer all of the assets, screenplay, any attachments that you may have, into that entity, and that is the entity into which your investors will put their money. Money and assets go into the LLC produces the movie, any revenues generated from the movie come out of the LLC. It's not you. You become attached to the LLC. You are hired by the LLC. You are not the LLC. So the first thing you have to do is decide, what's my entity? What do I want this to be? This can be tax-driven. It can be investor-driven. So, for example, many institutional investors prefer corporations. It used to be that LLCs were limited in that they only had one series of, or one class of membership interests. That's no longer true. It used to be that not all states had adopted the LLC statute. That's no longer true. It used to be that accountants didn't know how to treat LLCs, so their default was a corporation. That's no longer true. My default is an LLC, unless, for tax reasons, I'm told there is another type of entity that's preferred. Very easy to form. You can form them virtually overnight. They are formed by filing the articles of organization with a comparable document in whatever state you happen to be doing business. Let's talk California, you file with the Secretary of State. You overnight it. Even though the Secretary of State is incredibly backlogged and will not physically get to your documents inside of 6 weeks, our tax dollars hard at work, right? They at least honor the date on which they receive it. So if you FedEx it, overnight it, next business day, it's formed. And they'll even do a fiction, which, even though they're not open on January 1st, you could send it to them on the last day of December, and it has to be filed on January 1st. So you get a filing date as of the day that technically they're not open, but it's a fun thing. This is how we attorneys amuse ourselves. You form the entity. Now you have an entity with which to enter into your contract with your first attachment. What are these first attachments? It can be anything from a named producer or director. It can be talent, although that's highly rare. Why? Most talent agreements are so-called pair play agreements, which is a misnomer because they should be called pay and play. You pay either way. Before you enter into that agreement, I always, and I don't need to know you to tell you this advice, I always recommend having your production budget raised. You do not pull that trigger until you are ready to greenlight the project. You do not greenlight the project until you have your minimum production budget raised. What does that mean? That means you take a come hell or high water approach to things, right? Meaning, if I don't raise another dollar, I am still able to make the film on some level. It may not have my full wish list in it, but I'm able to complete the film. I'm able to get it in the can. Those initial attachments add what I think of as critical mass to your project. That critical mass, there's no magic to this. It can be a named director, it can be a named producer, it can be named talent, it can be any combination of those things. It can be a script made by a named writer. It can be a script by someone who has some chops. He may not be a name writer, but he has credits to his or her name. They may not even be movie credits. They may be book credits. I remember meeting with James years ago, before this book came out. We were talking about a movie deal. And the reason he intrigued me is because he had writing credits. Before 1906, 1906 blew up. It was huge. But even before that, he had writing credits. So his attachment to a project added critical mass to it. That critical mass helps to validate your project with investors. That's probably the single most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight. And you may be rolling your eyes and saying, yeah, how do I politely get up if that's the most important thing he's going to say? What I mean by that is readjust your sights. Assign importance to that. More importance than you probably are now. Because if you have that credibility, if your project has that critical mass, your chances of getting funded increase exponentially. The other thing that you can do is bring on someone like me, or Daniel, experienced legal counsel, who not only can walk you through a project, but can help your investors understand what it is they're getting involved in. Unless you're going to Southern California, or a venue where you have a reasonably good-sized pool of investors that are accustomed to investing in film, most investors, even though they may be sophisticated as investors, will not be sophisticated when it comes to film investment. So their learning curve is a steep one. And either you or someone on your team needs to help educate them. If you don't, and you don't provide them with a comfort level, they will not invest. It's really as simple as that. They have to understand the deal. You have to understand the deal. That's why I'm putting on this workshop, so that you and everyone who attends can better understand the deal. Too many people think that, well, I'll have my attorney do it. It's out of my hands. I don't need to do that. Well, how is this being struck? You know, ask my attorney. You shouldn't have to beg off on every question, especially the ones from investors, like that. You need to have at least a rudimentary understanding of how things are going to progress and what the deal looks like. Again, it provides your investors with that comfort level. If they don't sense that you know yourself, they're not going to give you the money to use for your film. Aside from studio financing and what I'll call end user or value add financing. End user financing being, for example, an exhibitor, a theater, or theater chain investing in content. It does happen. Sometimes IMAX, many years ago, was underwriting film because they wanted more film created for their theaters. They were having difficulty feeding the pipeline, and they were doing if-come deals where they were offering up to 50% of the film's budget just to fill those theaters with quality content. Value add. This is, so for example, you may have studios that post facilities that will provide services in connection with the film, and they're looking to feed their pipeline and earn monies on the services side. It's a little odd. They're taking money out of their right-hand pocket and getting it with their left. Sometimes they do in-kind deals where everything's on, it can be reduced to a budget in film. I either pay hard cash or I get some form of barter. Anybody who can potentially benefit from your film is a potential investor. And by investor, I mean either with cash or in-kind services. So for example, a post house might agree to do X amount of services, all of their services, in exchange for equity participation in your film, including back-end profit participation. Does everybody know what I mean by that, by the way? Okay. So let's talk about what's referred to as the waterfall. The waterfall is the distribution of monies after the film starts to earn money. So at the outset, we talked about forming a vehicle, an entity. That is the bucket into which money will be brought in. The film gets made at some point, assuming there's some sort of exploitation, anything from theatrical exhibition on down. And by on down, we mean to lesser forms of exploitation, not necessarily in terms of dollars, in terms of the cachet that goes along with them. And at some point, the film begins spinning off revenue, hopefully. That revenue going out, and the priority in which it goes out, is called the waterfall. How does the water fall or trickle? Who takes it first? Typically, investors take it first. And the range is anywhere from north of 100%. Daniel mentioned as high as 150%. Very expensive money. Very expensive money. The types of projects I deal with, I not only don't recommend it, I don't think I have done a deal at 150%. Over 8 years since I've had a 150% deal. That's very expensive money. It's rare, but expect to give away north of 100%. And anything north of 100%, you could think of it in rough terms as interest on the money. But there's nothing that says that the investor needs to receive 100% of every first dollar that comes in. So sometimes you create what are called corridors. You, the producer, I'm assuming, is this a fair assumption? Are most people in this room creators of projects, ultimately going on to be producers? Right? Okay. In order to get to that point where the film is made and generating income, you've had to go a while without seeing any serious money. And I mean, I'm factoring in prior projects you had in development that went nowhere. How much in option money, again, alluded to in the prior presentation, that you had to expend. How much you had to expend to get the project to a point where somebody else was interested in it. You had to hire a writer. And so consequently, you're going to be very reticent to have all of the first monies go out to your investors and leave you with nothing. So we have a bit of a conundrum here. On the one hand, you have investors who are putting up hard cash. And they will tell you, look, I'm providing the gas, all right? I want my money out first. And you, the producer, who are really the person who is responsible for this happening in the first place. It really depends on how hot of a property you have, both in terms of what rights you've acquired and what ultimately gets created, who your attachments are, and who your investors are. Relative leverage. But I'm telling you, you can, depending on the combination of those three factors, negotiate a corridor so that you're paid something from first monies. Why is this important? Here's another reality check for you. Reality is that most, meaning more than 50% of indie films do not recoup the investor's original investment. So, if I were to ask each of you to invest in my next project, knowing that, what would you as an investor say? Wouldn't you want first monies out and say, wait a minute, if the odds are against me, that I'm going to recoup my full investment, why should I give you anything? Again, it's about the relative leverage. Here's my counter to that, by the way. Remember I said that the investors you're going to hit up are high net worth investors? So think about it for a second. These same people park their money in other types of investments. We live in an epicenter of startups. Startups are funny. Startups require seed capital, angel capital, lots of it. Some of these startups still have, relative to 8 years ago, not the burn rates they had, but some of these startups have hefty burn rates. But here's the kicker. An investor invests in a startup with a healthy burn rate and may not have anything to show for it 18 to 24 months later. I mean, assets, these kind of assets, are sold at sales for the benefit of creditors. They get what we affectionately refer to in Yiddish as buckus. Nothing. Nothing of value. Films, on the other hand, if you raise at least your minimum budget to be able to make the film, you get it in the can, you've got something more than a chair. You have a real asset. And although you may not be able to recoup the full investment, they're still going to get back a significant percentage of their investment, unless you just completely drop the ball. So why do I say that? It's about relative risk. Same investors, same people are looking to park their money somewhere. It's an alternative investment class. What do? Do you put it on the bet that says, hey, if it's big, big returns. But at the very least, you won't have a fire sale. Or do you go for the glamorous Silicon Valley startup where chances are you're going to have just that. a fire sale. So in that sense, film suddenly becomes a better investment than high-tech startups. How can that be? I think the numbers bear it out. I think Thomas will actually vouch for this. So you have to persuade your investors that not only is your project worth their money, but that you are competent, playing the comparable role of management. You're competent to sail this ship through to navigate this ship through some very tricky waters. There are essentially two types of monies that you're seeking on the private equity side. Production monies and so-called P&A monies. P&A stands for prints and advertising. In the digital age, prints, 35mm prints, are becoming less and less, although if you're talking about a wide release, the majority of exhibitors, theaters, still do not have digital projection capability. And even those that do, don't necessarily have the highest quality projection capability. They have 2K projectors, not 4K projectors. So you may still need the P money, the prints money, but at the very least you're going to need something for digital transfers. But the big money is the A, the advertising, the marketing dollars. And this is especially true in, is everybody familiar with the concept of the long tail? So, yes? Chris Anderson, a couple years back, wrote a book by the same name called The Long Tail. And basically what it is that given digital distribution and digital production capabilities, he wasn't just talking about film, he was talking about media in general, that the hit model that used to dominate, and I'll focus my comments here just on the film industry, it used to dominate the movie industry, is no longer the only moneymaker. It used to be that you had to be in the top 30 or 50 projects to really get any sort of marketing dollars. And everyone else didn't even get the money to make their project, let alone the money to market it properly. Well, we live in a great time, interesting time too, as the Chinese are fond of saying. And we have a convergence now between various technologies which enable production for just about everyone. What I mean by that is the ease with which one can generate a soup-to-nuts solution. You write your own script, your final draft. You produce your own film on a digital camera, and you edit in Final Cut Pro. Has increased the number of people and projects that can be generated. What it hasn't done is gotten around a simple limiter, a governor, if you will. And that is, the project goes nowhere in the long tail unless you have some way of being heard above the sea of content that's now being created. That's what marketing dollars do. They raise awareness about your project. And the truth is, unless you find some way of raising awareness about your project will not have a theatrical run. It will go direct to video. And it will get lost on the video shelves. It will get lost on virtual video shelves. And what I mean by that is, you won't even generate enough attention to get brick and mortar stores to take your product. They have finite space. They can't afford to take product that's not going to fly off the shelves. That's the P&A budget. So you're raising production monies, and I include finishing funds. Some people separate those out. I include them as part of production monies. Finishing funds are just production monies where somebody didn't budget properly, or somebody pulled the trigger and they greenlighted their project too soon. And as a result, they're scrambling to raise additional monies to finish their project. It doesn't really matter whether you're bringing in seed money initially or whether you're able to put together a syndicate of investors. It is highly unlikely, unless you're dealing with a micro-budget film, that you won't have multiple investors. And that's why I say, for anything other than micro-budgets, it's all co-financing. And I mean that on two levels. I mean multiple investors and multiple types of money. So we're talking about equity investment now, but you also have debt investment, loans, right? Here's the difference. Equity, the investor takes the risk with you and says, all right, I'll buy a new division. If it takes off, I participate in the upside. If it doesn't, I'm out my money. And I can only get what we're able to generate in sales. Debt takes a completely different approach. They take collateral. And sometimes your IP, your intellectual property, meaning the script, isn't enough. I'll talk about that in a minute. And there's a maturity date. Just like your home loan. By such and such date, you must repay this loan. They don't take equity in your film, meaning if it's wildly successful, their return is capped. And it's capped at the interest that they charge and whatever service fees they have. And there's something in between. So in addition to the equity and debt, you've got something in the film industry known as pre-sale financing. What are pre-sales? So if you think of the world as this amalgam of territories and media types, media rights, you can divvy those up into what are referred to as split rights deals. You don't do a deal globally. A lot of times filmmakers make the naive mistake of thinking once it's in the can, their job is over. And anybody who's been down this path sort of snickers and realize it's just begun. Now the real fun begins. And that is your film, this artistic work, suddenly passes through this invisible space, and hopefully you pass through it with it, so that you can now see your film on the other side as product. Why is it important to see that? Because as long as you stay in this universe, you are an auteur, and you will not sell your film, because you're expecting everyone to take the time to watch it and to buy into your vision. And the reality is they don't have the time, they are inundated with product, and you're not speaking a language they understand. They, meaning these people on the other end, who are buying film, either for themselves, I mean, they are actually buying it, but I mean, they manage the territory, or as an intermediary. Sales agents, right? They represent your film and they say, I've got lots of contacts in these territories. I dig that film, which I'm really thinking of as product. Don't make any mistake about it. They are on the other side of that imaginary window. And I think I can sell. Well, what are pre-sales? Pre-sales are this fiction in time, which say, tell you what, I believe in your project enough, based on the attachments you have, based on the script you've got, based on anything else you've put together, like a vast majority of the money, you're raising a P&A budget as part of your money raise. I believe in this project enough that I, someone who can sell in a specific territory or a media type, will make a commitment to pay you X amount of dollars, a minimum guarantee, an MG, in exchange for the rights to your film in my territory or media type. You, filmmaker, now get to go to a bank and translate that commitment into a loan. It's not equity, it's a loan, and you're going to pay some decent interest on it. But at the end of the day, between pre-sales, between debt, and between equity, you cobble together your production budget. After cobbling all of this financing together, you may still not have enough to produce your film. So, GAAP is debt provided by a specific type of bank, a bank that's willing to take this specific risk, and based on the representations of a reputable sales agent, somebody that they have worked with before, they will loan you up to, now it's about 20% of your production budget, based on unsold territories. If they think that your film will in fact sell and get a lot more than that in those territories. They're discounting is what they're doing. But you're getting the money. You're getting the money from these people over here who are willing to pass through that dimension and give it to you before you've actually created your project. Before it's ever happened. It's a weird thing in the film industry, and there aren't many comparable financing schemes in other industries. But the film industry has it. In fact, it's so arcane that you don't even have it in many of these financing schemes in film's closely related stepsister, the music industry, which has its own nuances, but it's odd that it doesn't come about. And the last financing mechanism are production incentives, both domestic and foreign. On the domestic side, you can have both a municipal and state. Right now, San Francisco has a small incentive. Their big push right now is streamlining the permit process more than anything else. But it is very hard to compete with states like New Mexico that are actually providing tax incentives plus cash. States like Louisiana that have an entire industry whereby they are selling the tax credits that the state gives for your below the line. States like Michigan, which are now giving away an over 40% tax rebate. Very difficult, especially coming from this state with a governor who made his money in the one city in the state that is still, amazingly, with all the runaway production that we've had, is still showing an increase over last year. That's a personal decision that you have to make, personal to the project, whether or not it makes sense to shoot out of state, or whether the tax incentives are even large enough to justify the additional expenditure of having to schlep your entire production out of state. But those 5 areas are the ways that you cobble together, that most indie producers cobble together their financing. That's why I say say for micro budgets, everything is co-financing, and it's imperative that you as producers understand how to do that, and understand that there is no magic to the percentages. There's not even a rule of thumb that says, for example, 80% of your film should be equity. Right? It doesn't exist. Every deal is different. What's important is that you understand the mechanisms by which you finance your film and understand some of the terminology so that you're not just simply turning it over to an attorney and you're not letting other people dictate how your project is going to get financed. You wouldn't let somebody else dictate how it gets made. This is your baby. And if you are going to turn over creative control, it's going to be to someone who shares your vision. The same is true on the financing side. But you can't turn over control to someone else until you understand what your vision for the financing of your film is. So come to the workshop. I encourage you to. It's March 28th and 29th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.